is actually a scary statistic about Muslims. The statistic goes and says more than half of the third generation of Muslim origins who live in the West turn out to be non-Muslims. Again, this scary statistic says more than half of the third generation of Muslim origins who live in the West turn out to leave Islam eventually, which is crazy. These are the three statements that they seem separated and disconnected, but we together, inshallah, we will see how connected they are. Allow me to discuss these three statements in reverse, starting with number 3. This statistic is actually scary and raises a red flag. It basically tells us that more than half of the third generation of the Muslims who live in the West turn out to be non-Muslims, aka they leave Islam. This might sound crazy at first, but if we leave our emotions aside, and if we think logically about the sequence of events, unfortunately we'll realize how realistic this statistic is. My brothers and sisters, what did Allah want from us? What does Allah want from us? Didn't He subhanahu wa ta'ala say in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that I have not created the jinn and the mankind except to worship me? Didn't He say in many places in the Quran, إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put us here on this earth to establish His deen and to spread His message and to worship Him exactly how He commanded us to. But what happens to us here in the West sometimes, to be fair, not all the times, is that we get too busy in life. We get too busy collecting positions. We get too busy with businesses. We get too busy in growing our wealth to the point that we start treating this life as the main goal, and we forget all about the actual purpose of us being here on this earth. If we logically think about the sequence of events that happens to us here in the West from one generation to the next, we will realize, and if we take an example of a Muslim who migrated here to the West, that Muslim, alhamdulillah, in so many cases they would be righteous, they would establish prayers, they would practice their Islam just fine. But unfortunately, again, in many cases, the first generation of Muslims would get too busy in life here in the West, working, establishing businesses, collecting positions, growing the wealth, to the point that they stop paying attention, or to be fair, they stop paying enough attention to the connection between the deen and their kids, or the connection between their kids to this deen. They won't have enough time to monitor the connection between their kids and this deen. They would not have enough time to sit down and address the doubts and falsehood and fallacies that their kids might face. Sometimes they would not have enough time to pay much attention to the Islamic upbringing of their kids. Especially since most of us here would send their kids to public schools. Some of us would send, and by the way, I'm not talking about just Champaign or Urbana. This is a Muslim community at large issue. What would happen is some parents would send their kids to public schools just because there's no Islamic school in the area. Other parents would send their kids to public schools just because they can't afford the tuition of Islamic schools, and we know it's not free. Other parents would send their kids to public schools because they do have the money, but they don't want to spend that much money on tuition. And other parents would just do that because XYZ public schools have a high rating and they're so good in math and sciences and all of that. Regardless of the reason, the end result is we have so many of us going to public schools. And that by itself is not the issue, by the way. That by itself is not the issue. The issue starts when many parents would not have enough time to address what their kids are exposed to at schools. It happens when many parents would not have enough time to sit down with their kids and explain the gaps they don't learn in public schools.